Europe, 1943. The continent lay buried under smoke and fire. From the icy fjords of Norway to the burning plains of Italy, the sky itself had become a battlefield. Every dawn carried the growl of engines, the echo of sirens, and the haunting promise of another day of death from above. For years, the Luftwaffe had ruled that sky. Its sleek Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs slashed through the clouds like silver predators, shredding Allied formations before they could even glimpse their targets. The Allies called it the Black Sky, a time when no bomber could cross the channel without losing men and hope. In the first months of 1943, the air war had turned into a grim arithmetic. Every mission over Germany cost hundreds of young lives. B-17 flying fortresses, once symbols of American power, returned to their bases in shambles. Engines aflame, wings torn, gun turrets empty. Some didn't return at all. Entire squadrons vanished into smoke. In the debriefing rooms of England's airfields, the air was thick with the smell of oil, coffee, and despair. Pilots stared at the floor while intelligence officers spoke of acceptable losses. But everyone knew nothing about this was acceptable. Germany's war machine still roared at full capacity, its cities alive with factories churning out tanks, aircraft, and bullets faster than the Allies could destroy them. The mission was clear: cripple the Reich's industrial heart before it crushed Europe entirely. But without control of the air, it was suicide. Across the channel, inside the dark bunkers of the Luftwaffe High Command, confidence still reigned. Field Marshal Erhard Milch and General Adolf Galland boasted that no enemy could breach the iron sky. Their radar networks, airfields, and fighter wings formed an invisible fortress around Germany. To many Allied planners, that fortress seemed unbreakable. Yet history, as it often does, was waiting for a single spark, one mind reckless enough to rewrite the rules of war. Before that man arrived, the skies over Europe were ruled by fear. Each bombing run began with prayer and ended in fire. Radio chatter crackled with panic. Tail gunners screamed warnings. Bandits at 6 o'clock, before tracers stitched across the fuselage. From 30,000 feet, the earth below was an inferno. Hamburg, Cologne, and Essen burned night after night. Civilians huddled in bunkers, listening to the endless thrum of bombers and the whine of German flak cannons. The sound was constant, a deadly heartbeat that defined life in wartime Europe. For Allied crews, survival was a lottery. Captain Henry Hawk Lawson of the 384th Bomb Group later wrote, "You didn't think about living or dying. You thought about the man next to you, whether he'd make it home. Sometimes he didn't." By mid-1943, the losses were staggering. In October alone, the 8th Air Force lost nearly a quarter of its bomber strength over Schweinfurt and Regensburg. The mission had been meant to cripple Germany's ball-bearing industry. Instead, it crippled the morale of an entire air fleet. Something had to change. In London, at Allied command meetings, voices clashed. The Royal Air Force favored night bombing, believing daylight missions were madness. The Americans, still committed to precision strikes, insisted they could hit the heart of Germany, if only they could survive the trip. And in that chaos, rumors began to spread of a new leader coming to take charge of the American air war. A general with a reputation for impossible missions and unshakable nerve. Some called him brilliant, others called him insane. But before he arrived, the war continued its brutal rhythm. Pilots climbed into their bombers each morning, writing letters they'd never send. Ground crews painted new names on the noses of aircraft: Liberty Bell, Memphis Mary, Hell's Angel. The paint barely dried before those planes vanished into smoke. The Luftwaffe, though strained, still fought with ruthless precision. Its aces, men like Hartmann, Barkhorn, and Galland, cut down enemy bombers by the dozens. German civilians, though weary, looked to the sky with pride whenever the sirens wailed. For them, the Luftwaffe was the last shield of the fatherland. But under the surface, cracks had begun to show. Fuel shortages, overstretched production, and exhausted pilots whispered of an empire at its limit. The Allies didn't know it yet, but the Luftwaffe was bleeding slowly, invisibly. In the English countryside, airfields expanded like steel cities. Hangars filled with new machines, faster, stronger, more daring. Engineers worked around the clock, experimenting with auxiliary fuel tanks, new engines, and escort concepts. Somewhere among those endless rows of planes stood a silver shape that would soon change everything. The P-51 Mustang. Its arrival went unnoticed at first, just another fighter in a war filled with them. But for the men in the cockpits, hope was returning, faint and fragile. The winter of 1943 was bitter. Frozen mud clung to boots, engines refused to start, and fog smothered entire bases. Yet even in that gloom, the sense of a turning tide began to build. Intelligence reports hinted at German weaknesses. Commanders whispered of new tactics, bolder, riskier, maybe even suicidal. The stage was being set for something the world had never seen, a complete reversal of air power, not through numbers but through sheer audacity. And somewhere in Washington, a general with fire in his eyes and a mind full of rebellion was preparing to cross the Atlantic. He had no patience for half measures, no belief in acceptable losses. His name would soon become legend and controversy, but that was still to come. For now, Europe's skies remained a graveyard. Each contrail drawn across the heavens marked the path of courage, and the cost of it. Villages below counted their dead in silence. And above the clouds, in the freezing roar of thin air, thousands of young men carried the weight of the war on their wings. The world held its breath. The fire had already begun to burn, but no one yet knew that the man they would soon call the Mad General was about to turn that fire into a storm that would consume the Luftwaffe itself. January 1944. The icy winds of England's winter swept across the airfields of East Anglia, carrying with them the low thunder of engines preparing for yet another mission. Thousands of young men, exhausted, hollow-eyed, and unsure how many more dawns they would see, climbed into their flying fortresses once again. The losses from the previous year had been catastrophic. But that winter, something new arrived in Britain. A man, not a machine. A general with eyes like steel, a pilot's swagger, and a mind that burned with ideas most called reckless. His name was James Harold Doolittle. To most of the airmen stationed across the muddy fields of England, Doolittle was already legend. 2 years earlier, in 1942, he had led the audacious Tokyo raid, a desperate gamble that launched 16 B-25 bombers from the deck of an aircraft carrier, something no one believed possible. The mission had struck Japan's heart only months after Pearl Harbor. It was risky, nearly suicidal, but it changed the morale of an entire nation. Now, that same man had been appointed to command the 8th Air Force, the backbone of America's strategic bombing effort over Europe. The move shocked many within the Allied command. Doolittle was not a bureaucrat. He was a flyer, an innovator, a man who broke rules when rules didn't work. And in the skies over Europe, the rules weren't working at all. The 8th Air Force was bleeding. In daylight raids over Germany, formations of B-17s and B-24s were being torn apart by Luftwaffe fighters before they even reached their targets. The Luftwaffe's dominance seemed total. The generals in London spoke of caution, of retreating to safer missions. But Doolittle had other plans. From the moment he stepped onto the cold tarmac at Debden Airfield, his reputation preceded him. Crews gathered to watch him disembark. A short, compact man with sharp features, a confident stride, and a look that told everyone he had no intention of losing this war. He spoke little at first, preferring to observe. But when he did speak, every man listened. "Gentlemen," he said during his first briefing, "our mission is simple. Destroy the Luftwaffe. Not weaken it, not contain it. Destroy it." It was a declaration that rippled through the ranks. Until then, the strategy had been purely defensive. Protect the bombers, get them to the target, and bring them home. Doolittle wanted the opposite. He wanted to go after the enemy's fighters where they lived. He understood something few others dared to consider. The Luftwaffe was not invincible. It was vulnerable if struck at its core. Its strength was not in machines, but in men, highly trained, irreplaceable pilots who could not be mass-produced. To destroy the Luftwaffe, he would not defend against it. He would hunt it. Doolittle gathered his senior officers, among them Earl Partridge, Jimmy Johnson, and Hoyt Vandenberg, and laid out his plan. He wanted the new P-51 Mustangs, with their long-range capability, to escort bombers not just to the target but deep into Germany, and, crucially, to break formation and attack German fighters directly. It was a radical idea. For years, doctrine demanded that escort fighters stay close to bombers like sheepdogs guarding a herd. Breaking away was forbidden. Too dangerous, too unpredictable. But Doolittle wasn't looking for predictability. He was looking for victory. "If we stay in formation," he told his pilots, "the Luftwaffe chooses the fight. If we take the fight to them, we choose." His commanders hesitated. The plan risked leaving bombers exposed. Losses could skyrocket. But Doolittle saw further than they did. He knew that every German fighter destroyed was one less to threaten the bombers tomorrow, and Germany could not replace its pilots as quickly as America could build planes. Within weeks, the new orders went out. Fighter groups were to engage the Luftwaffe wherever possible. Airfields, convoys, even lone aircraft on runways were now fair game. The message was simple and terrifying. No German plane was safe, anywhere. When the first missions under Doolittle's command launched in early 1944, the effect was immediate. Mustangs soared ahead of the bomber streams, diving on Luftwaffe interceptors with lethal precision. The hunters had become the hunted. German pilots, long accustomed to dictating the terms of combat, suddenly found themselves ambushed. Their bases were strafed, their fuel trucks set ablaze, their hangars turned to twisted metal. The Luftwaffe's once fearsome aces now faced a relentless, unpredictable enemy, one that fought not by the book, but by instinct. On the ground, Doolittle drove his men harder than ever. He visited airfields daily, shaking hands with mechanics, speaking to young pilots before takeoff, listening to their frustrations. He had no patience for empty optimism, only for results. "You do your job," he told one Mustang group, "and I'll make sure you have the fuel and firepower to finish it." To many, his leadership felt almost dangerous, a mix of daring and defiance that bordered on madness. Some in the British High Command whispered that he'd get half the Air Force killed. But to the men who flew under him, Doolittle's madness felt like something else: freedom. They no longer felt trapped in a defensive war. Now they were predators, and the results began to show. By February, Luftwaffe losses spiked. German radar operators reported unprecedented Allied aggression. The Mustang's long range meant no airfield, no supply line, no pilot was beyond reach. In a matter of weeks, the air war's rhythm had shifted. Still, the cost was heavy. Missions ran long, fuel ran low, and many Allied pilots never returned. But morale, that fragile, invisible fuel of war, began to rise for the first time in months. Crews felt they were finally hitting back, not just surviving.
Minenwille, in Berlin, Alarmbells rang.
Field Marshal Hermann Göring, once proud and confident, now raged in frustration. "If we lose the air, he shouted in a fit of fury. "We lose the war!" He was right, and Doolittle knew it. By March 1944, the transformation was undeniable. The Luftwaffe, still formidable, was on the defensive. Every engagement drained its veteran pilots. Every raid stretched its resources thinner. Doolittle's strategy, reckless to some, revolutionary to others, had ignited the beginning of the end for German air superiority. In the freezing dawns of that spring, as Mustangs lifted from misty English fields, one could sense that the war in the sky was changing forever. The men who once flew in fear now flew with purpose. And at the heart of it all stood a man many still called mad, a general who refused to accept the limits of reason when victory demanded the impossible. James H. Doolittle had not just emerged. He had arrived, and with him came the storm that would soon tear the Luftwaffe from the sky. The winter fog over England lingered like a curtain that refused to lift. Beneath it, the men of the 8th Air Force prepared for another day of battle, but this time under new rules. For years, Allied air doctrine had been carved in stone. Bombers flew in tight formations, the legendary combat box, believing that their combined machine gun fire could fend off any attacker. Fighter escorts were to stay close, protect the bombers, and never, under any circumstance, chase the enemy too far. Discipline, not daring, was the gospel of the sky. But James Doolittle had come to tear that gospel apart. From the first days of 1944, his headquarters became a battlefield of ideas. Senior officers, hardened by losses, argued that breaking formation was madness. They showed charts, casualty reports, fuel range calculations, proof that the only safety lay in numbers. Doolittle listened quietly, his arms crossed, eyes sharp as bayonets. Then he said simply, "Gentlemen, the Luftwaffe doesn't fear our discipline. It fears our unpredictability." The room fell silent. That was Doolittle's creed, control through chaos. He believed that air superiority couldn't be achieved by defending bombers like fragile cargo. Victory would come only by taking the fight into enemy airspace, destroying German fighters before they ever reached Allied formations. To prove it, he redefined the mission of his fighter groups. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs were no longer shackled to bomber wings. They were hunters now, free to roam, free to strike. The change caused an uproar. Veteran commanders who had lost hundreds of men over Schweinfurt and Regensburg feared more bloodshed. They called Doolittle reckless, impulsive, even suicidal. The British air staff looked on in disbelief. To them, daylight precision bombing was already close to lunacy. Now this American general was unchaining his escorts and sending them deep into German skies alone. But for the young pilots, men barely in their 20s, it was liberation. They had spent months flying like prisoners, circling bombers, watching the Luftwaffe pick them off just out of reach. Now, at last, they had permission to strike back. Captain Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group recalled, "Doolittle gave us wings, not leashes. The first time we went hunting, we didn't wait for them. We found them." The new strategy quickly took form. P-51 squadrons began launching ahead of bomber streams, sweeping German airspace like wolves before the herd. They hit interception points, stalked Luftwaffe squadrons, and attacked enemy airfields at low altitude. The results were immediate and devastating. German air controllers reported chaos. The carefully timed interception tactics that had worked for years now collapsed. Luftwaffe pilots scrambled from their bases only to find Allied fighters waiting overhead. Airfields once considered safe became death traps. By mid-February 1944, the balance in the sky began to tilt. Doolittle's critics, however, were far from silent. Inside command meetings in High Wycombe, some senior officers pressed him hard. "We're leaving our bombers unprotected," they warned. "They're sitting ducks without their escorts. Doolittle met their arguments head-on. He pointed to intelligence intercepts. The Luftwaffe's fighter losses were climbing fast. The Germans were losing their most experienced pilots faster than they could train replacements. "Every fighter we destroy," Doolittle said, "saves 10 bombers tomorrow." It was simple arithmetic, brutal but true. Still, the cost on both sides was steep. The air over Germany became a slaughterhouse of aluminum and flame. Dogfights erupted at every altitude. Tracers arced through the clouds like comets. Pilots fought not for glory, but survival. And yet, something had changed. The fear that had haunted Allied crews for years began to fade. For the first time, bomber formations reached their targets without suffering total annihilation. Cities like Brunswick, Leipzig, and Augsburg burned under waves of precision raids. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin, was forced to defend everywhere at once, and failing. Doolittle's revolution wasn't just tactical. It was psychological. He had given his men permission to fight the enemy on their own terms, to think, to improvise, to outsmart. It was no longer a rigid chess game of formations and rules. It was a living, breathing fight for dominance in the sky. The transformation rippled beyond the airfields. In Washington and London, analysts noticed something extraordinary. Allied bomber losses were dropping, even as missions deepened into Germany. The reason was clear: the Luftwaffe was being dismantled piece by piece. But Doolittle's defiance still met resistance. Old doctrines die hard, especially in war. Some traditionalists accused him of abandoning the very principles that had kept the bomber offensive alive. He didn't care. "War doesn't reward tradition," he told one colonel. "It rewards results." By March 1944, his results spoke louder than any debate. The Luftwaffe was bleeding. Its veteran squadrons were shattered. Its fuel supplies dwindled under relentless Allied strikes. And with each mission, Doolittle's madness looked more like genius. Still, he knew the fight wasn't over. The Luftwaffe was wounded, not dead. German factories continued to produce fighters by the hundreds. But without seasoned pilots, those aircraft were little more than iron coffins waiting to fall from the sky. Doolittle's vision, once ridiculed, had begun to reshape the entire Allied air war. What began as rebellion was becoming doctrine. Commanders across Europe adopted his aggressive tactics. Escort fighters became hunter-killers. The concept of air superiority was no longer abstract. It was measurable, visible, and achievable. The skies of Europe were changing color. No longer black with smoke and fear, they now shimmered with contrails of confidence. Every Allied sortie carried a new sense of purpose. The hunters were winning. The old doctrine had crumbled. The new vision had taken flight. And behind it all stood one man, small in stature, vast in will, who refused to accept that reason alone could win a war. James Doolittle had broken the rules of air combat, and in doing so had begun to break the Luftwaffe itself. The winter of 1944 brought more than cold winds to the airfields of England. It brought a revolution in metal and wings. Rows of silver aircraft stood glistening under a pale sun, engines rumbling like caged thunder. Among them was a new arrival, a fighter unlike any the world had seen. Sleek, fast, elegant, and deadly, the P-51 Mustang. At first, no one realized how much it would change the war. It had been born almost by accident, a design rushed by the North American Aviation Company when the British asked for a new fighter in 1940. The early versions were good, but not great. They lacked power at high altitude and range for deep raids. But when engineers fitted it with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, everything changed. The machine that rolled out of the hangar was no longer just another fighter, it was a game changer. With that British engine and American frame, the P-51 could climb higher, fly faster, and, most importantly, go farther than any escort before it. It could finally do what every bomber crew had prayed for: accompany them all the way to Berlin and back. The Mustangs first appeared quietly among the thunderbolts and lightnings that guarded the bomber streams. Pilots noticed the difference immediately. The plane felt alive, light to the touch, agile in the air, yet strong enough to dive straight into a fight and come out unbroken. One pilot, Lieutenant William Tex Morgan, described his first flight this way: "You didn't fly the Mustang, you wore it. It moved where your thoughts went." To Doolittle, the Mustang was more than a fighter. It was the weapon he needed to make his vision real, the key to finally taking the war into Germany's heart. In early 1944, he ordered P-51 squadrons to be assigned to long-range escort duty. Their mission: protect the bombers and destroy anything that tried to stop them. The results were immediate and dramatic. On their first deep penetration missions, Mustangs escorted the massive B-17 and B-24 formations all the way to Leipzig and beyond. When German fighters rose to intercept, the Mustangs met them head-on, breaking their formations apart with swift, brutal precision. The Luftwaffe's veteran aces, men like Johannes Steinhoff and Erich Hartmann, quickly realized the tide was shifting. The American bombers no longer flew unguarded over Germany's industrial heartland. The new fighters had range, speed, and firepower, and they refused to play by old rules. Suddenly, the hunters had become the hunted. German pilots spoke of ghost fighters that appeared from the sun, striking fast and vanishing just as quickly. P-51s swept through the skies in loose, aggressive packs, diving onto enemy formations, chasing them back to their own airfields, then strafing the runways as they tried to land. The effect was devastating. By the spring of 1944, Luftwaffe losses skyrocketed. Aircraft destroyed in the air were no longer their only problem. Now their bases were under attack too. Fuel depots, hangars, and parked planes went up in flames under the relentless Mustang assaults. Everywhere the bombers went, the P-51s followed, a silver shield of vengeance. Back in England, bomber crews felt the difference. The sky, once filled with fear, now carried a strange new sound: the high-pitched whistle of Mustang engines cutting through the flak. Crews looked out from their gun turrets and saw them, slim, graceful fighters slicing through German lines. It was hope made of metal. A gunner from the 100th Bomb Group later said, "When we saw those Mustangs overhead, we finally believed we might make it home." The statistics told the same story. Before the Mustangs, bomber losses had been catastrophic. Sometimes 1 in 5 never returned. By mid-1944, those numbers began to drop sharply. Doolittle's gamble was paying off. But it wasn't just about technology. The Mustang was a symbol, proof that Allied innovation and persistence could outthink and outfly the German war machine. It was a fusion of British engineering and American boldness, born of desperation and perfected by necessity. Every mission tested the Mustang's limits. Fuel range remained razor-thin. Many pilots glided back to England on fumes. Engine failures, freezing altitudes, and fierce combat took their toll. Yet the aircraft endured, and so did the men who flew them. These were young pilots, often 19 or 20, flying over enemy territory for hours at a time, alone, at altitudes where the air could freeze a man's blood. But they fought with a kind of wild courage that matched the machine beneath them. And Doolittle demanded nothing less. He wanted the Luftwaffe broken, not bent. Every Mustang squadron received the same order: if you see the enemy, engage. If he runs, chase him. If he hides, find him. That spirit of relentless pursuit began to crush the German Air Force from within. By April 1944, German commanders were sounding alarms. They reported shortages of trained pilots and rising losses in every sector. The Allies were not just striking factories, they were erasing the Luftwaffe's ability to fight back. Each destroyed aircraft meant months of lost training and resources. Each dead pilot meant an irreplaceable veteran gone forever. The skies over Germany, once filled with the roar of Messerschmitts, began to empty. And still, the Mustangs came in greater numbers in tighter formations, flying deeper into enemy territory than ever before. The long-range escort fighters had become the sharp edge of Allied air power, carving a path toward victory. In Berlin, Hermann Göring himself reportedly looked to the sky one day and saw silver contrails, American bombers and their escorts, flying freely over the Reich's capital. He turned to his aides and said bitterly, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." He was right. The birth of the long-range escort fighters had rewritten the laws of aerial warfare. For the first time, the Allies could project power anywhere, at any time, without fear of losing the sky. The Luftwaffe had built its empire on distance, believing its enemies could never reach deep enough to strike its heart. The P-51 destroyed that illusion. From that moment on, the air belonged to the Allies. And for James Doolittle, watching from the control tower as the silver wings disappeared into the horizon, it was clear. The age of defense was over. The age of domination had begun. Spring, 1944. The skies over Europe trembled with the roar of engines. The Allied bombing campaign had entered its most dangerous phase, the push into the very heart of Hitler's Reich. For 2 years, Allied command had treated Germany's airspace like a fortress to be breached cautiously, one raid at a time. But now, under General James Doolittle, that caution was gone. In its place stood something far more dangerous: audacity. Doolittle's new orders shocked everyone. The escorts would no longer defend, they would attack. Until then, the mission of Allied fighters was simple: stay close to the bombers, shield them from enemy interceptors, and bring them home. But Doolittle's new strategy turned that logic upside down. He told his pilots, "Gentlemen, if you see the enemy, don't wait for him to come to you. Go after him. Hunt him down. Break him." It was, by every traditional standard, reckless. But Doolittle understood what others did not. Defense alone could never win the sky. The Luftwaffe had to be destroyed at its roots, its airfields, its pilots, its very will to fight. And so began what historians would later call the reckless gamble, a campaign of total aerial offense unlike anything seen before. The new orders unleashed the P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts like wolves into the heart of Germany. No longer tethered to bomber formations, they roamed freely, attacking wherever the Luftwaffe showed its face, and often where it didn't. They struck at enemy fighters as they took off, strafed hangars, fuel depots, even trains carrying replacement parts. They dove low over airfields, machine guns blazing, kicking up clouds of dust and fire. German ground crews called it the time of terror. For the first time, the Luftwaffe's pilots felt hunted in their own skies. But this gamble came at a cost. Without fighter protection, the bombers flew exposed through thick belts of flak and interceptors. The early weeks of the campaign were brutal. Dozens of bombers fell in flames, their crews bailing out over enemy territory or vanishing entirely. In briefing rooms across England, officers questioned Doolittle's sanity. "He's sacrificing our bombers," some whispered. Others called him ruthless, even obsessed. But Doolittle didn't flinch. He saw further ahead than anyone else. Every German fighter destroyed today meant 10 fewer attacking tomorrow. Every pilot lost was a wound Germany couldn't heal. The Allies could build more planes, the Luftwaffe could not replace its men. "We are fighting a war of attrition," he told his staff. "If we must pay in machines to destroy their pilots, then that's the price." The gamble was working slowly, brutally. By March 1944, Luftwaffe casualties soared. The once feared German aces found themselves overwhelmed. They scrambled to meet Allied raids, only to be ambushed by Mustangs waiting in the sun. Famed German ace Adolf Galland later admitted, "We no longer had the initiative. The Americans had taken it and they never gave it back." The Allies called it Operation Argument, but the men who flew it knew another name: Big Week. For 7 relentless days in February 1944, wave after wave of bombers and escorts attacked Germany's aircraft industry. The factories at Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and Leipzig. The raids were massive, the air battles apocalyptic. Flak filled the sky like black rain. Entire bomber groups were torn apart, but they kept flying. Behind them came the Mustangs, slashing through the clouds, diving on enemy interceptors. In those days, courage became routine. Pilots who survived spoke of dogfights so close they could see the faces of their enemies. Wide eyes behind fogged glass, the flash of tracer fire, and then nothing but smoke. A Mustang pilot from the 357th Fighter Group recalled, "You didn't think about fear anymore. You just thought, if I don't kill him, he kills my friends." The gamble's results were staggering. By the end of Big Week, the Luftwaffe had lost nearly 1/3 of its remaining strength. Hundreds of aircraft were destroyed on the ground and in the air. More importantly, hundreds of irreplaceable German pilots were gone. Factories were reduced to rubble. Supply lines broke down. The Luftwaffe's once perfect machine began to stutter and choke. For the first time, the balance had shifted irreversibly. Still, the price was heavy. Allied losses were immense. Crews returned to England in smoking wrecks, or not at all. In the debriefing rooms, chairs remained empty, reminders of the men who had gambled everything so others could live. But Doolittle's eyes never wavered. He saw what others could not yet see, the beginning of the end. By spring 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer a predator. It was prey. Its pilots were exhausted, its bases in ruins, its skies filled with the contrails of enemy bombers it could no longer stop. And yet, Doolittle was not satisfied. He pushed harder. Every airfield, every factory, every train became a target. He told his men, "The Luftwaffe is our enemy. Not their cities, not their soldiers, their air force. Break it, and the war will fall." He had turned the air war into a campaign of annihilation, and it was working. The German people, once comforted by the roar of their own fighters overhead, now heard only the endless hum of Allied bombers. Towns burned, rail lines vanished, and the Luftwaffe, the pride of Hitler's empire, was bleeding out in its own sky. Historians would later say Doolittle's gamble changed the war. It wasn't just a new tactic, it was a new philosophy. Victory through total control of the air. The reckless gamble had begun in defiance, fought through fire, and paid for in blood. But it would end not in chaos but in triumph. Because behind that gamble was not madness. It was genius. And soon the world would see its full power. By the summer of 1944, the skies over Europe no longer belonged to Germany. What had once been the proud domain of the Luftwaffe was now a graveyard of smoke and contrails. Only a few years earlier, the world had watched in awe as German pilots swept through the skies of Poland, France, and Britain, seemingly invincible. But now, their empire of air was collapsing. Not with a single decisive blow, but through 1,000 small defeats, bleeding it from the inside out. The Allied long-range strategy, unleashed by Doolittle's bold orders, had done more than destroy planes. It had broken the machine that kept the Luftwaffe alive. The first cracks appeared in the training schools. By 1944, Germany had lost most of its experienced instructors, killed in combat, captured, or too exhausted to continue. The new generation of pilots being rushed to the front had barely 40 hours of flight time, compared to the hundreds that Allied aviators received. They were sent into battle almost unprepared, their nerves already frayed before they ever saw the enemy. Veteran ace Johannes Steinhoff later wrote, "Our new pilots were boys. Brave, yes, but without the skills to survive even their first mission. They were being slaughtered." Meanwhile, Allied fighters roamed the skies like predators. Every airfield became a target. Mustangs and Thunderbolts swept down in daylight raids, strafing runways, fuel depots, and parked aircraft. Fuel, once the lifeblood of the Luftwaffe, became a luxury. The Allied bombing of oil refineries at Ploiești and Luna crippled production. By mid-1944, most German fighter units received only a fraction of their required fuel. Some squadrons were grounded entirely. Mechanics drained fuel from training planes to keep combat units flying. Others mixed low-grade synthetic gasoline that caused engines to seize midair. The Luftwaffe was dying not just from enemy bullets, but from starvation. Inside the command bunkers, morale disintegrated. Reports from the front were desperate. No fuel, no replacements, no rest. The words repeated over and over like a death sentence. Even Hermann Göring, once the confident architect of Germany's Air Force, could no longer hide the truth. His speeches grew erratic, his promises hollow. He blamed his commanders, his pilots, even the weather, anything but his own failed leadership. One Luftwaffe officer, in a letter later discovered after the war, wrote bitterly, "We are lions led by clowns." By contrast, the Allies grew stronger each week. Waves of bombers crossed the Channel daily, protected by swarms of P-51s. The skies, once a place of fear, had become a symbol of Allied dominance. Even German civilians could see the change. Once, they had cheered as their sleek Messerschmitts roared overhead. Now, they watched helplessly as Allied bombers filled the heavens, their engines droning without challenge. In cities like Hamburg, Munich, and Berlin, people huddled in shelters as the bombs fell, asking the same question in whispers: "Where are our fighters?" The answer was simple: there were none left to send. By August 1944, the Luftwaffe's combat strength had been cut in half. Those who survived were overworked, undertrained, and demoralized. Replacement aircraft sat unused, for lack of fuel or pilots. Some German squadrons began flying only at dawn or dusk, hoping to avoid Allied patrols. Others took off knowing they might not have enough fuel to return. In desperation, the Luftwaffe introduced new aircraft, the Messerschmitt Me 262 jet, the first of its kind. On paper, it was revolutionary, faster than anything in the sky. But it came too late. There was no fuel to fly it, no pilots skilled enough to use it, and no time left to change the course of the war. The few that did take off were hunted mercilessly by Mustangs during takeoff and landing, the most vulnerable moments of flight. The German dream of air supremacy had become a nightmare of hopeless defense. And while the Luftwaffe collapsed from the outside, it also began to rot from within. Jealousies, rivalries, and political interference eroded what little unity remained. Göring refused to listen to his field commanders. Promising new leaders like Galland and Steinhoff were sidelined for speaking the truth. Galland's later words summed up the tragedy. The Luftwaffe was not beaten only by the enemy. It was destroyed by its own blindness. Meanwhile, in England, Allied airfields buzzed with confidence. Every morning, pilots climbed into gleaming Mustangs, briefed not on defense, but on destruction. The enemy's decline was visible from the air. Fewer interceptors, slower responses, fewer radio calls. The once fierce air battles had turned into one-sided hunts. A pilot from the 4th Fighter Group recalled, "By late summer, it wasn't a fight anymore. It was a chase. They were running, and we just kept coming." And yet, even as their skies crumbled, many German pilots kept flying. Outnumbered, outgunned, and out of hope, They fought with desperate bravery. Some refused to surrender, diving into impossible odds rather than land their planes. They fought for their comrades, their country, and for the last fragments of an honor long betrayed by the men above them. But courage could not replace oil, nor bravery replace strategy. By the time the Allies prepared for D-Day in June 1944, the Luftwaffe could no longer mount an effective defense. The skies over Normandy were almost entirely Allied-controlled. Out of nearly 1,500 German aircraft in France, barely 300 were flyable, and fewer than half had fuel for combat. Doolittle's gamble had paid off. He hadn't just destroyed the Luftwaffe, he had broken the system that sustained it. Every wrecked hangar, every lost pilot, every empty fuel drum was part of the same truth. The Luftwaffe was no longer a weapon of war. It was a relic of a past Germany could no longer afford to dream about. By the autumn of 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow, its commanders disillusioned, its aircraft scattered, its pilots fighting ghosts in the sky. What had once been Hitler's sharpest sword was now a broken blade. And while the ruins of Germany burned beneath the bombers, one man in a leather flight jacket stood quietly on an English airfield, watching the silver wings return from another mission. General James Doolittle knew that the war was far from over, but the sky, once ruled by the enemy, now belonged to him. He had risked everything on a reckless gamble, and against all odds, he had won.